All right, so I've been meaning to do a video on this for a long time, and I doubt I'll probably just fucking delete this right after I shoot it because it's an impossibly broad, complex subject, right? And it's so abstract what I'm going to talk about, and it sounds semi-conspiratorial, and it's going to be probably way too long. So I'm going to do my best to make it quick, but also kind of detailed, and go through two seemingly disparate notions and kind of connect them. And I think they're deeply interconnected, even if I don't do a good job explaining that. And that's neoliberalism and sort of the rise of not just purely positive dog training, right? But sort of the dominance of like behaviorism is a model in dog training, but more so purely positive training. So what is neoliberalism? Okay, so it's the same people who don't know what neoliberalism is, by the way. They're the ones who are always have passionate arguments that they got from, MSNBC or Fox or whatever, and they have to just vomit them on Facebook. It's an imperative, it's an involuntary thing that they do, despite the fact that they have no detailed understanding of really how our political system, both domestically and globally, really functions, and what the underlying ideology is that drives it. So just to define it quickly, and I urge you to not only Google the topic, but really if you want to read a book, it's like 150 pages, if that. It's called A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey. Okay, if you want to really understand the nuances, because it's an ideology, it's an economic framework, or it's an economic ideology. But it also seeps into culture. Politics and economics are never separate. So, political economy, it's the dominant ideology that, it's not a partisan notion either, okay? So it's basically dominated both parties since, I want to say, the early 80s, maybe even the late 70s, So I'll do my best to define this as quickly as possible. It's the notion, first of all, what it is, and it's not liberal and it's not new. It's liberal in the like 18th, 17th traditional liberal European sense of liberalized markets. Okay, Dewey's a neoliberal, like Milton Friedman. Actually, I named him after John Dewey, who's like a progressive era intellectual who would be deeply, resistant toward and against the neoliberal movement, which has come to dominate modern society and our political system. I mean, he's just a fucking retard, but that's him. Anyway, so neoliberalism is the push to have markets dominate basically every aspect of our lives, of society, but particularly the political system. And in spaces that were, traditionally up until the mid to late 1970s dominated by the state, now political elites sought to impose markets in those domains. So whether it was, land, housing, that would be more in the UK, deregulation, obviously, and heavy tax cuts, but also creating markets where they weren't previously. So I think the best example, like healthcare would be one. So they're trying to do away with like the NIH in Great Britain or whatever. Stuff like that. So massive deregulation, eradication of the public sector, and replacing it with markets. And the irony of the neoliberal sort of ideology or movement, if you want to call it, because really I think of it as a class movement by elites, is that it requires a strong state in order to impose these markets, So you need an expansion of not just police and military, but like surveillance and stuff like that. Because here's the thing, man. Up until World War II, it was commonly held that markets and democracy were in inherent conflict with one another. So that was just a tacit assumption everywhere. And then after World War II, because of the rise of communism, there were great efforts to kind of sell the public, and it was done quite successfully, that market freedom and individual freedom or democracy were one and the same. And in fact, you couldn't have democracy without totally free markets. And of course, it's total myth. And if you want to look at places where the neoliberal project has been most successful, probably Chile in the 70s under Augusto Pinochet. You know, killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, murdered them, you know, dissidents. And that was Milton Friedman, this Chicago economist who was one of the pioneers of the neoliberal project. It was his boy. And you can look this shit up in the New York Times. This isn't like going Alex Jones and, you know. So neoliberal project is really about market fundamentalism. And it expands beyond just the political economy. It really seeps into everything. It's a very pernicious kind of movement and idea. And we're creating markets everywhere. And you can see it in subtle ways. I mean, you really want to deconstruct it. I could write a fucking book on this, on how you see symptoms of it in the culture, how it shaped the culture. But Facebook's a great exemplar. So like, you know, like we're all on Facebook and we're creating like this image of ourselves that we're trying to sell. Okay, the marketplace of ideas. And people put stuff up, and if the crowd likes it, they vote on it. The most liked ideas get passed on. The wisdom of crowds or of markets. And of course the embedded and inherent implicit narcissism that drives all of it. This is all a big part of this society that we're living in, which is undergirded fundamentally by this neoliberal market dogma, okay? Everything's transactional. There's no more room for group solidarity. But what there is room for, okay, and this is where I'm going to weave it into the dog training stuff, is at the level of personal identity, okay? Dewey, get the fuck out of there. He's expressing his personal identity too much. So I'm old school. I have to tell him that's not cool. Anyway, individual rights within the neoliberal framework, because it espouses, I think this is mostly rhetoric, but it espouses virtues of its quasi-libertarian values, like personal freedoms, personal identity. Get the fuck away from that. Go blow your brains out, Dewey. He ruins every video. And this is like the fucking only one of three I've done that I find personally interesting, and it's impossible to do in under like 3 hours. So anyway, individual liberties. So sexual liberty, ethnic and racial liberty, so long as it doesn't interfere in the market domain. And this is in women's rights, stuff like that. So that's permissible in a neoliberal framework. And of course, what do we see? On the left, where they can't touch economics anymore, because the left has been thoroughly co-opted by neoliberal economics, okay? Bill Clinton, I mean, this is not a progressive guy. This is not fucking FDR the second, you know? He's as neoliberal as they get. I mean, this is a dude who in the 80s might have been almost to the right of Reagan, you know? I mean, that was only a decade before he was in office. So, but where they retain their sort of this patina, the superficial veneer of liberalism on the left is on social issues. And that's permitted, like I said, there's this libertarian strain in neoliberalism because it doesn't really interfere with markets, right? But any collective solidarity at the group level, like the unions and shit like that, it just gets eradicated in the present system. That's, empirically observable. It's easy to see. So animal rights, I think, has been and will continue to blow up more and more as increasingly an identity-based issue that gets co-opted into the neoliberal framework, because this whole ideology or movement or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, economic dogma, it's brilliant at sort of having a wide tent and co-opting what were traditionally, in many ways, progressive values. Okay, so civil rights, right? Well, okay, we can give individual rights, but individual rights kind of in the absence of economic rights tend to be meaningless, okay? When you have 3 people in the country with more wealth than 90% of the bottom population, right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, I think, and Warren Buffett, I think are the 3. They have more wealth combined than the bottom 90% of the population. Under that framework, it doesn't really matter You know, if the Huffington Post is beating the drum over LGBT, you know, shit every day, or we can't, comedians can't make jokes. Okay, all this politically correct bullshit, and what's happening is those sort of like traditional leftist or liberal energies that were there trying to help the underdog for so long, they can't go anywhere because economics is really the only thing that matters. So what are they doing? They're exploiting increasingly identity-based politics, because more and more there's convergence in the economic realm between the right, which is basically like this sort of like proto-fascist fucked up thing right now. This really kind of gone off the rails. And then the supposed left, like I said, you look at guys like Chuck Schumer, they got nowhere to go, you know, because they're owned by Wall Street and stuff, and they're, you know, the elites are largely, there's a consensus about markets and that they should guide people's lives more than anything. And that's, you can see it in all different ways in our culture through self-help shit. And in identity-based politics, it becomes sort of like this displaced energy of the left. And that's what's going on with animals. So if you look at when neoliberalism first took hold, it was in the early 80s or late 70s when Margaret Thatcher came to power, right? Tina, there is no alternative to the marketplace. That's right around the time when the purely positive movement really began to gain traction. And I don't want to say that's when behaviorism became dominant in dog training, because I'm not sure of that. I wouldn't be shocked about it. Now, I don't find that to be merely incidental. I think that as you have this increasingly transactional, market-based dogma that has come to dominate not just the political economy, but has seeped into the culture in myriad ways. And also, you have this leftist energy that isn't going anywhere, and it needs to be put someplace so that they, you know, like affluent white liberals can tell themselves they're decent people, so if they're sticking up for the underdog, for whatever reason, they need to do that for themselves. You know, so now they're running out of identities to exploit, you know, and animals are a perfect place to put it, because what else do we humanize more than dogs, right? So I think it was a confluence of those two, and it just kind of got co-opted in the neoliberal framework. And I think it's only going to get worse. Now, the behaviorist model being dominant in dog training, that's at all levels, man. And one of the guys, you don't have a ton of discussion about innate drives of dogs like you should. You do in the working dog community maybe, but still, man, it's like, wait, Cubby, calm down, buddy. Fucking bad separation anxiety. But it's like behaviorism is way, way over here over the ethological drives and instincts of the animal, you know. And in the same way that, like, discounting the ways that human beings are unique in many ways, you know, so or language capacity would be one thing. It's dehumanizing the humans, right? Well, it strips this species of their integrity and their uniqueness and their vitality, because behaviorism kind of lies on the supposition that all animals, all species, learn by the same basic mechanisms, which is bullshit. I don't believe that. I think that there's a good chance that both classical and operant conditioning are just wrong, empirically, or that they're just crudely correct, you know. Maybe 20, 30 years we'll kind of look back at, Jesus Christ. But, you know, particularly operant conditioning, it falls pretty nicely under the rubric of this neoliberal market-based dogma. Incentives, okay, the transactional nature, particularly on the purely positive side, which only works with two quadrants of operant anyway. And the sort of like, instinct has been supplanted by this behaviorist framework, and I think it's a huge error. What it does is it defines the organism downward, just like by defining people in terms of markets, we're defining human beings downward. And it's really, really, really bad for dogs, and it's obviously bad for people, and it's a system that isn't working. But I think you can just passively observe this if you're kind of a dog geek or a trainer, you look online and you see like dog training friends, Cubby, quiet! And they're all into self-help, which huge symptom of the fucking neoliberal virus. You read self-help, dude. It's like, it gets your own house in order before you even look outside at the guy who's freezing to death on the corner. Don't worry about the world. We're atomized. Clean up in here. All that other shit doesn't matter. It's a horrible. I mean, I think it's evil self-help, just like neoliberalism is. And I could talk about that for an hour, but I know that ruffles some people's feathers. And the reason it ruffles feathers is because people that are into it are cult-like, just like the purely positive people. And so you see, there's a lot of different reasons why the dog trainers are into self-help stuff, but it's all over the place in people's posts, but also just in their advertising, their marketing, their rhetoric. And you know, that's a cultural outgrowth of neoliberalism. You just have to take my word for that, because to explain it would probably take another hour. But most people don't even know what neoliberalism is, so look it up. And I just want to, real quick before I end this, because Cubby's driving me a little nutty right now. But I want to, this was written in 1981. One of my favorite political commentators, Mike Davis, the year I was born. And he made some predictions about what he thought, this is the 90s, but after we're going to look like. This is when Reagan first got into office. So I'll just read, it's about a paragraph long, it's a little long, sorry. But if you listen to what I'm saying, you're going to be like, Jesus Christ, this guy was on point. I'm connected to the dogs after. But anyway, this is page 304. And the name of the book is Prisoners of the American Dream. All right. So what the Kerner Commission report found to be two societies, separate and unequal, may by 1990 be three distinct societies, as segregated from one another as if apartheid were economic common law in the United States. At one pole will be the sumptuary suburbs and gentrified neighborhoods occupied by the middle class, the rich and the elements of the skilled white working class. Undoubtedly, neoliberalism will seek to preserve the superstructures of social liberalism. This is great right here. Sexual toleration, free and virtually unlimited choice among cultural commodities, and the general ethos of human potential, self-help, while building new parapets between this gilded paradise and the other social orders. All right. Outside the first circle of the damned will be the ghettos and boroughs, now joined by déclassé and deindustrialized layers of the white working class. Possessing citizens' right to a minimal social safety net, this enlarged low-wage working class would remain politically divided and disenfranchised as unions continue to be destroyed and the influence of labor and minorities within the political system declines. Yada, yada, yada. This sector of the nation will increasingly encounter social degradation, relative impoverishment in the next crisis cycle. But by 1990, there will be a large outer perimeter of U.S. composed of workers without citizens' rights or access to the political system at all. An American West Bank of terrorized illegal laborers. Yikes, right? He was with Doc when they stole the magazine, when Trump stole the magazine, Back to the Future 2. And he wrote this, that's how. Policing the widening divisions in American society at a time of economic crisis and vanished hopes for the return of full employment economy may involve not only futuristic techniques of surveillance and preemptive repression, sanctioned by the longevity of the Burger Supreme Court, but also the further dissemination of a culture that justifies a spiraling viciousness necessary to justify socioeconomic apartheid, like Facebook or self-help. The reason I read that fucking tome right there was the part about the sexual liberation. Okay, and I that's what I'm getting at, where the left has nowhere to go, so they're exploiting, you know, basically it's like this commodification of personal identity. The dog's a part of that. And I think just the general softening of the culture too, and the atomization of narcissism that is an outgrowth of neoliberalism is seeping over to the dogs too, and that explains the cult-like, sort of like, purely positive shit. But in any event, if you look at the history of dog training, sort of the relational, we'll call it traditional obedience era, it ended in the early 80s, right around the same time neoliberalism became dominant, became orthodoxy. So I'd urge you to read up on this political history even if you don't have interest in dogs. And if you do have interest in both, look at it, because this isn't something, this is my idea, just because I find, I love dogs and I'm with them every day, but this is the shit that really interests me, and the political stuff. And it's tragic, and I think the dogs are suffering for it just like we are, and that might be kind of a loose connection that I drew, but I don't think it is. And one last thing I want to talk about is, like, a lot of people talk to me. I think they think I'm like an alt-right weirdo. I'm very much like way to the left, like progressive. I'm basically like a Bernie Sanders guy. But I believe in free speech, and I think that political correctness is like the death of the human soul. We can't even be ourselves with each other anymore. So, now that's what liberalism is. It's just adherence to this strict, culturally codified set of restrictions on speech. And it's like Lena Dunham telling everyone what to think, not just what they can say, but what they can think. Especially if you're a fucking white male, And I don't care. I'm not, I'm a fucking disenfranchised white male. It's annoying, But the fact is that I think that speaks to how politically illiterate people really are, because they don't understand these broader issues. And neoliberalism, you're not going to see the New York Times write about it a whole lot. There's a great article in the Guardian a couple of years ago on it. But, again, it's not Alex Jones stuff. This is part of public record. You can look into everything I said. And, read those books. They're great books. But spend some time reading books and less time on MSNBC and Fox. And then, once you fully understand in depth, the driving factors behind our political situation, and understand as an ideology, as an economic framework, as a political movement, what neoliberalism actually is, then these things become a little bit more salient. And you start to, you can connect the dots to things that seem kind of not that connected. And you can kind of see like, oh, okay. All right, that's sort of what's a big part of what's driving this cultural development. And that's all this shit with the dogs is, with the purely positive stuff. And even with the overemphasis on behaviorism. And getting away from like, an ecological approach. Or a relational approach, whatever. So there's deep stuff at work here, and I think that once you understand the ideological framework driving it, then this stuff pops out to you like it does to me. And it might not seem like such a stretch. Anyway, a little long, but I've been wanting to make this video for a while. No one cares about this shit, but I do. So, but think about it and think. That's the most important thing.